1967. The jungles of Vietnam. The North Vietnamese Army's best trackers, men who had hunted French paratroopers, men who could read footprints like you read a newspaper, suddenly stopped trusting their own eyes. Tracks that walked backward. Footprints that vanished into thin air. Boot impressions that split into directions that defied the laws of physics. These trackers weren't stupid. They weren't beginners. Some had 30 years of experience reading the jungle floor, and now they were refusing to follow certain trails, reporting to their commanders that the forest itself had become _zero_ professional humiliation in an army where failure meant severe punishment. What the hell was happening out there? The Americans had 50,000 troops in that region, helicopters, napalm, artillery, the most advanced military technology ever deployed in jungle warfare. And yet it wasn't the Americans causing this chaos. It was 150 men. Just 150. From a country most Vietnamese had never heard of. Australia. The enemy called them Ma Rung, the phantoms of the forest. And what these phantoms were doing to their boots, yes, their boots, would become one of the most psychologically devastating tactical innovations of the entire Vietnam War. The Pentagon spent years trying to explain the numbers. Australian SAS kill ratios that made American special forces look like amateurs. 500 to 1. Let that sink in. For every Australian lost, 500 enemy fighters eliminated. The Green Berets? 50 to 1. The legendary Mackie V SOG? Maybe 100 to 1 on a good day. How? How was this possible? The answer involves Aboriginal trackers with 40,000 years of hunting knowledge. Classified techniques the Pentagon tried to bury. Methods so controversial that American liaison officers requested transfers rather than witness what came next. And a simple trick with a boot sole that made the entire North Vietnamese tracking doctrine worthless overnight. Stay with me. Because what you're about to learn has never been properly told. The full story of how 150 Australians terrorized an entire army, and why the American military didn't want you to know about it. This is the secret history of the cut boot tactic. And trust me, the ending will change everything you thought you knew about the Vietnam War. The jungle floor told stories to those who knew how to read it. And in 1967, deep in the suffocating green hell of Phuoc Tuy Province, the North Vietnamese Army's best trackers were reading a story that made no sense whatsoever. Footprints that walked backward. Boot impressions that suddenly vanished into thin air. Tracks that split into impossible directions, as if the men making them had learned to defy the basic laws of physics. The trackers, many of whom had spent decades hunting French paratroopers and American Marines through this exact terrain, found themselves confronting an enemy that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of warfare. They called them, the phantoms of the forest. And what these phantoms were doing to their boots would become one of the most psychologically devastating tactical innovations of the entire Vietnam War. But this was no supernatural phenomenon. This was Australian ingenuity at its most ruthless. The men responsible for this terror operated out of a dusty firebase called Nui Dat, roughly 65 kilometers southeast of Saigon. They belonged to the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, a unit so small that the Pentagon initially dismissed them as irrelevant to the broader war effort. The entire Australian SAS commitment to Vietnam never exceeded more than 150 operators at any given time. Compare this to the thousands of American Green Berets, Navy SEALs, and MACV-SOG commandos flooding the country, and the Australians seemed like a statistical footnote. The Americans had helicopters, artillery, napalm, and the most sophisticated military technology ever deployed in jungle warfare. The Australians had something else entirely. They had patience, they had bushcraft, and they had a willingness to become something that most Western soldiers found deeply uncomfortable. The _3_ tactic emerged not from some classified military laboratory or Pentagon think tank, but from the practical problem-solving of men who understood that in the jungle, your footprints were your signature. Every step you took wrote a message to anyone following behind. The NVA and Viet Cong had elevated tracking to an art form, employing specialists who could determine not just how many men had passed through an area, but how much they were carrying, how tired they were, and whether they were moving with confidence or fear. A fresh boot print in the Vietnamese mud was essentially a neon sign announcing your presence, direction, and intentions. The Americans attempted to solve this problem with technology and firepower. They called in airstrikes to cover their extraction routes. They used helicopters to insert and extract teams, minimizing ground movement. They developed specialized jungle boots with Panama soles designed to leave less distinct impressions. All of these solutions had merit, but they also had limitations. Airstrikes announced your presence to everyone within 50 kilometers. Helicopters were loud, expensive, and created predictable insertion patterns that the enemy learned to anticipate. And even the best jungle boots still left a recognizable American footprint. The Australians took a different approach. They decided to make their footprints lie. The basic technique was elegantly simple and psychologically devastating. SAS operators would take captured NVA or Viet Cong boots, the distinctive rubber-soled sandals made from recycled tires, or the canvas jungle boots supplied by China and the Soviet Union, and cut them in specific ways. Some operators would slice the sole in half and reattach it facing backward, so that anyone following their tracks would believe they were walking in the opposite direction. Others would attach enemy soles to the bottom of their own boots, creating a hybrid footprint that suggested Viet Cong insurgents rather than foreign soldiers. The most sophisticated practitioners would carry multiple sets of modified footwear, switching between them throughout a patrol to create the impression of several different groups moving through the area. But the cut boot tactic was merely the most visible element of a comprehensive deception doctrine that transformed the Australian SAS into something unprecedented in modern warfare. The psychological impact on enemy trackers cannot be overstated. Imagine spending your entire adult life learning to read the jungle floor like a newspaper, developing an almost supernatural ability to reconstruct events from bent grass and displaced pebbles, only to encounter tracks that violated every rule you had ever learned. The footprints said one thing, but the other signs, the way vegetation was disturbed, the pattern of broken twigs, the subtle compression of leaf litter, said something completely different. It was as if the forest itself had begun to lie. NVA after-action reports captured later in the war reveal the extent of the confusion. Tracking teams would follow what appeared to be a small Viet Cong supply party, only to walk directly into a devastating SAS ambush. Others would pursue _4_enemy forces in what they believed was the direction of flight, moving further and further from the actual Australian position with every step. Some trackers simply refused to follow Australian trails at all, reporting to their commanders that the jungle in certain areas had become _5, a professional humiliation that carried severe consequences in the rigidly hierarchical NVA command structure. The psychological warfare extended far beyond confused tracking. The Australians understood something that many American commanders never fully grasped. In a guerrilla war, fear is a weapon system as potent as any rifle or artillery piece, and they deployed fear with the same precision they applied to their ambush tactics. One of the most controversial elements of Australian SAS operations involved the deliberate display of enemy remains. When an SAS patrol eliminated an NVA squad, they would sometimes arrange the aftermath in ways designed to maximize psychological impact on whoever discovered the scene. Bodies positioned in specific configurations. Equipment scattered in patterns that suggested panic and helplessness. And most disturbingly, signs that the Australians had moved through the area completely undetected, struck with overwhelming violence, and vanished without a trace. The message was unmistakable. You cannot see us, you cannot track us, you cannot predict us, and when we choose to strike, you will not survive. American liaison officers who observed these tactics reported profound discomfort with what they witnessed. One MACVSOG captain, whose name remains classified in Pentagon records, allegedly told his debriefers that the Australians _6_. He meant this as a criticism. The Australians took it as the highest possible compliment. But where did these methods come from? How did a small contingent from a relatively peaceful nation on the other side of the world develop jungle warfare techniques that surpassed both their American allies and their Vietnamese enemies? The answer lies in the Australian outback and in a partnership that most military histories have deliberately overlooked. From the earliest days of their Vietnam deployment, Australian SAS operators worked closely with Aboriginal trackers, whose families had been reading the Australian bush for over 40,000 years. These indigenous Australians brought tracking skills that made even the best NVA jungle specialists look like amateurs. They could determine when a person had passed through an area by the behavior of insects. They could estimate body weight from the depth of footprints with accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. And they understood, at a level that Western military science was only beginning to appreciate, that the relationship between hunter and prey was fundamentally psychological. The Aboriginal trackers taught the SAS operators that successful hunting was not about physical superiority or technological advantage. It was about understanding how your prey thought, anticipating their reactions, and manipulating their behavior through carefully crafted stimuli. A skilled hunter did not simply follow his quarry. He created conditions that caused his quarry to move in predictable ways, to make mistakes, to betray their own position through panic or overconfidence. Applied to human prey, these principles transformed Australian SAS patrolling doctrine into something revolutionary. The standard American approach to jungle patrolling emphasized firepower and extraction capability. When American special forces encountered the enemy, their training prioritized calling for air support, establishing defensive positions, and if necessary, fighting their way to a helicopter landing zone. This approach reflected American military culture's emphasis on technological superiority and the fundamental belief that in any fair fight, American forces would prevail through superior equipment and training. The Australians rejected this philosophy entirely. They trained to avoid contact whenever possible, to move through the jungle leaving no trace, and when contact was unavoidable, to strike with such devastating surprise that the enemy would be eliminated before they could respond. An Australian SAS patrol that called for extraction was considered to have failed in its primary mission. These men expected to walk into the jungle, remain undetected for 10, 14, even 21 days, gather intelligence, eliminate targets of opportunity, and walk out again without the enemy ever confirming their presence. The numbers tell a story that the Pentagon spent decades trying to explain away. During the entire Vietnam War, the Australian SAS conducted over 1,200 patrols in some of the most heavily contested terrain in the country. They achieved a documented elimination ratio that dwarfed equivalent American units. Some analysts estimate the figure at better than 500 to 1, meaning that for every SAS operator lost, more than 500 enemy fighters were confirmed neutralized. The American Green Berets, widely considered the most elite jungle warriors in the U.S. military, achieved ratios closer to 50 to 1 under similar conditions. The Phuoc teams, who conducted some of the most dangerous cross-border operations of the war, rarely exceeded 100 to 1. How was this possible? How could a force of barely 150 men, operating without the air support, artillery coverage, and technological advantages available to their American counterparts, achieve results that seem to violate the basic mathematics of warfare? The cut-boot tactic provides a window into the answer. Every element of Australian SAS doctrine was designed around a single principle. The patrol must never be detected. Not rarely detected, or difficult to detect, but never. This was not an aspirational goal, but an operational requirement that shaped every decision from equipment selection to movement techniques to rules of engagement. Consider the standard Australian SAS patrol loadout. While American Special Forces carried M16 rifles with their distinctive sound signature, many Australian operators preferred the L1A1 self-loading rifle, a heavier weapon, but one whose report was less identifiable as Western in the jungle soundscape. They wrapped every piece of metal equipment in cloth tape to eliminate noise and reflection. They removed all insignia, identification, and anything that could connect them to Australian forces if captured or if their equipment was recovered. Some patrols carried no food that required cooking, surviving for weeks on cold rations, rather than risk the smell of heated meals alerting enemy patrols. The emphasis on silence extended to communication. While American forces relied heavily on radio contact with fire-based support, Australian SAS patrols often maintained complete radio silence for days at a time, communicating only through pre-arranged signals or in absolute emergencies. The reasoning was coldly practical. Every radio transmission was a potential detection opportunity. The NVA had become increasingly sophisticated at radio direction finding, and a single burst of encrypted traffic could bring enemy forces converging on your position within hours. But the most significant difference was philosophical rather than technical. American military doctrine treated the Vietnamese jungle as an obstacle to be overcome, a hostile environment that needed to be dominated through technology and firepower. The Australians treated the jungle as a weapon system to be mastered and deployed against the enemy. They learned its rhythms, its sounds, its patterns of life. They understood which birds fell silent when humans approached, and which insects changed their behavior in response to body heat and carbon dioxide. They knew which trails the enemy favored and why, which water sources were used at which times of day, where the local Viet Cong infrastructure operators hid their supply caches. This knowledge came at a price that many American commanders were unwilling to pay: time. An Australian SAS patrol would spend days, sometimes weeks, simply observing before taking any action. They would map enemy movement patterns, identify leadership figures, determine supply schedules, and build a comprehensive picture of the local insurgent network. Only when they understood the target environment completely would they strike. And when they did, the results were catastrophic for the enemy. The ambush techniques developed by Australian SAS remain classified in several key details to this day, but the general principles have entered the broader special operations community. Unlike American ambushes, which typically relied on superior firepower to overwhelm the enemy, Australian SAS ambushes emphasize surprise, positioning, and psychological shock. A typical Australian ambush involved far fewer operators than American doctrine recommended, sometimes as few as 4 men engaging enemy units of 20 or more. But those 4 men would be positioned with such precision, would initiate contact with such devastating effect, and would vanish so quickly afterward that the surviving enemy often had no clear idea what had happened or where the fire had come from. The cut-boot tactic played directly into this ambush doctrine. By creating confusing or misleading track signatures, Australian patrols could manipulate enemy movement toward prepared ambush sites. A tracking team following what appeared to be retreating Viet Cong guerrillas would move with confidence, their attention focused on the trail ahead rather than on the surrounding jungle. They would walk directly into an ambush zone where every firing angle had been calculated, every escape route blocked, and every contingency planned for. The first they would know of the Australian presence would be the sound of their own men falling. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Australian SAS operations was what happened after the ambush, or rather, what didn't happen. American forces typically secured ambush sites, called for helicopter extraction, and evacuated any captured equipment or prisoners. This process, while tactically sound, created a predictable pattern that the enemy learned to anticipate. They knew that after an American ambush, there would be helicopter activity, radio traffic, and usually artillery fire to cover the extraction. They could track these patterns, and over time, develop countermeasures. The Australians simply disappeared. After an ambush, an Australian SAS patrol would move immediately and silently away from the contact site, often leaving enemy remains and equipment exactly where they fell. They would not call for extraction unless absolutely necessary. They would not request artillery support. They would simply melt back into the jungle, often establishing an observation position nearby to watch how the enemy responded to the ambush, gathering additional intelligence for future operations. For the NVA and Viet Cong, this created a terrifying uncertainty. When one of their units failed to report in, there was often no way to determine what had happened to them. Had they been ambushed by Australians? Had they deserted? Had they been captured by South Vietnamese forces? Had they simply become lost in the vast jungle? The lack of the usual indicators, helicopter activity, artillery fire, radio intercepts, meant that Australian operations often went completely undetected by enemy intelligence. Units would simply vanish, and the jungle would keep its secrets. This uncertainty magnified the psychological impact of every confirmed Australian contact. If every ambush generated the usual American response, helicopters, artillery, radio traffic, then each incident could be categorized, analyzed, and eventually predicted. But when some ambushes generated no response at all, when units disappeared without any trace of what had happened to them, the enemy was forced to confront the possibility that the Australians were everywhere and nowhere, that any trail could be a trap, that any routine patrol could be their last. The cut-boot tactic fed directly into this atmosphere of terror. Enemy trackers who had grown up learning that the jungle floor never lied were now confronting tracks that seemed to mock their expertise, footprints that defied logic, trails that led nowhere, signs that contradicted each other in ways that suggested either supernatural intervention or an enemy who had learned to manipulate the fundamental language of jungle warfare. Some NVA commanders reportedly forbade their men from following Australian tracks at all, preferring to lose contact with the enemy rather than walk into what increasingly seemed like certain elimination. The Americans watched all of this with a mixture of fascination, admiration, and profound discomfort. Pentagon analysts who studied Australian SAS operations during the war consistently struggled to reconcile the results with American military doctrine. The numbers were clear. Australian methods worked. The elimination ratios spoke for themselves. But the methods themselves raised troubling questions about the nature of warfare that American military culture was not prepared to answer. The cut-boot tactic was, in many ways, the least controversial element of Australian operations. Far more disturbing to American observers were the psychological warfare techniques, the extended patrols without support, and what some reports euphemistically called, quote, 10, employed against captured enemy personnel. Several American liaison officers requested transfer away from Australian units, citing philosophical differences with their approach to warfare. Yet the same Pentagon that expressed official discomfort with Australian methods was quietly studying them for potential application. Classified after-action reports from the period reveal that American Special Operations Commands were deeply interested in Australian techniques, particularly their tracking countermeasures and ambush doctrines. Elements of Australian SAS methodology began appearing in American training programs by the early 1970s, though never officially attributed to their Commonwealth allies. The cut-boot tactic specifically was studied extensively by MACVSOG, and later incorporated into their training curriculum, though with modifications that reflected American operational priorities. But the Americans never fully adopted the Australian approach, and some military historians argue that this failure contributed to the ultimate outcome of the war. The fundamental difference was not technical but cultural. American military doctrine was built around the concept of decisive engagement, finding the enemy, fixing them in place, and destroying them through overwhelming firepower. This approach had worked brilliantly in World War II and Korea, where conventional forces faced each other across defined battlefields. In Vietnam, it generated the infamous, quote, 11 metric, the strategy of attrition that sought to eliminate enemy forces faster than they could be replaced. The Australians understood, perhaps better than any American commander, that in a guerrilla war, this approach was fundamentally flawed. You could not eliminate your way to victory when the enemy could simply blend back into the civilian population, could regenerate losses from a seemingly inexhaustible supply of committed fighters, and could outlast your political will to continue the conflict. The only path to success was to make the enemy afraid, to demonstrate that any aggressive action would be met with certain, unpredictable, and devastating retaliation. The cut-boot tactic was a small piece of this larger strategy, but it illustrated the core principle perfectly. By making their movements unpredictable and untraceable, the Australians multiplied their effective strength many times over. An enemy commander who knew that Australian SAS patrols operated in his area but could not determine their location, strength, or intentions, was forced to treat every square kilometer as potentially hostile. He had to disperse his forces to guard against threats that might or might not exist. He had to waste resources on tracking efforts that led nowhere. He had to watch his men's morale erode as rumors spread about phantom soldiers who could not be seen, tracked, or anticipated. 150 Australians, employing these methods consistently over their years in Vietnam, achieved strategic effects that tens of thousands of American troops could not replicate through conventional means. But the story of the cut-boot tactic has a coda that most military histories prefer to ignore. When the war ended in 1975, Australian SAS veterans returned to a nation that was deeply ambivalent about their service. Unlike their World War II predecessors, who came home to parades and national gratitude, Vietnam veterans, Australian and American alike, found themselves targets of protest and hostility from a generation that had come to see the war as a moral catastrophe. The tactics that had made them so effective in the jungle became sources of shame rather than pride, whispered about rather than celebrated. The cut-boot trick and the broader deception doctrine it represented were quietly retired, mentioned only in classified training documents and veteran memoirs that attracted little public attention. The official Australian military history of the conflict, published in the 1980s, devoted surprisingly little space to the specific methods that had made SAS operations so effective, focusing instead on conventional measures of success and the political context of the Australian commitment. American military historians, meanwhile, had their own reasons for minimizing Australian contributions, acknowledging that a small Commonwealth force had achieved results that dwarfed American efforts, raised uncomfortable questions about the billions of dollars spent, the hundreds of thousands of troops deployed, and the fundamental assumptions underlying American military doctrine. It was easier to treat Australian success as a statistical anomaly, a product of their small force size and limited area of operations, than to confront the possibility that American methods had been fundamentally flawed. But among special operations professionals, the men who had actually served alongside Australians, who had witnessed their methods firsthand, who had seen the terror in the eyes of enemy prisoners when they realized they had been captured by Ma Rung, the truth was never in doubt. The Australians had figured something out that took American special operations decades to fully appreciate. Trace elements of Australian SAS Vietnam doctrine began appearing in American Special Forces training by the late 1970s, though rarely with proper attribution. The emphasis on stealth over firepower, on psychological warfare over body counts, on patience over immediate action. These principles gradually infiltrated American SOF culture through instructors who had served in Vietnam and recognized the superiority of Australian methods. The cut-boot tactic specifically evolved into broader counter-tracking doctrine that remains part of special operations training today. Modern American operators learned to manipulate their footprint signature, to move through terrain without leaving traceable evidence, to use deception actively, rather than simply trying to minimize their presence. These techniques are taught as American innovations, but operators who know the history understand their true origins. When American Special Forces began operating in Afghanistan after 2001, some of the older generation of operators, men who had studied Vietnam-era tactics in detail, reportedly advocated for approaches that closely mirrored Australian SAS doctrine from 30 years earlier. Long-duration patrols without external support, emphasis on human intelligence over technological solutions, psychological warfare designed to make the enemy fear the unknown rather than simply fear American firepower. How much of this Australian-derived doctrine was actually implemented remains classified, but veterans who served in both theaters have noted striking parallels between successful American operations in Afghanistan and the methods that proved so effective in Vietnam's jungle. The cut-boot tactic itself may seem like a minor historical footnote, a clever trick that belongs to a specific time and place, but it represents something far more significant in the evolution of special operations warfare. The understanding that in unconventional conflicts, the most powerful weapon is not the one that causes the most destruction, but the one that creates the most fear. The NVA trackers who encountered those impossible footprints in the Phuoc Tuy jungle were not defeated by superior firepower or overwhelming numbers. They were defeated by uncertainty, by the terrifying realization that their professional expertise had become useless, that an enemy existed who had learned to manipulate the fundamental language of their craft. That psychological defeat echoed far beyond the individual trackers who experienced it. It spread through NVA units as rumors about the, quote, 13, who left tracks that made no sense. It influenced operational planning at the highest levels as commanders struggled to account for an enemy who refused to behave according to predictable patterns. It contributed to an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that multiplied the effective strength of Australian forces many times over. 150 men, 1,200 patrols. An elimination ratio that still staggers military analysts who study it today. And at the heart of it all, a simple tactical innovation. Boots that were cut to make the jungle lie. The Americans brought helicopters, artillery, napalm, and the most sophisticated military technology ever deployed in counterinsurgency warfare. The Australians brought knowledge passed down from Aboriginal trackers who had been reading the land for 40,000 years, combined with the ruthless creativity of men who understood that in the jungle, perception was more important than reality. They created fear from footprints. They manufactured terror from the simple act of walking. And they demonstrated, in ways that military historians are still working to fully understand, that the psychological dimension of warfare can matter more than any amount of conventional military power. The cut-boot tactic was never officially acknowledged by the Australian military during the war. It was too effective, too valuable, and too controversial to discuss openly. NVA and Viet Cong intelligence spent years trying to understand how Australian patrols seemed to appear and disappear at will, never suspecting that the answer might be as simple as a modified sole on a jungle boot. When Australian SAS veterans finally began sharing their experiences decades after the war, the cut boot trick became one of the most frequently discussed innovations. It captured something essential about the Australian approach: the willingness to think differently, to question assumptions, to find creative solutions to fundamental tactical problems. An American Special Forces veteran who had served as a liaison officer with Australian units later wrote that the cut-boot tactic revealed the essential difference between the two military cultures. The Americans, he said, would have responded to the tracking problem by developing a better boot, by creating some technological solution that could be manufactured in quantity and distributed throughout the force. The Australians responded by changing the way they thought about the problem itself. The boot was not the issue. The track was not the issue. The real issue was the enemy tracker's confidence in his own expertise, and the cut-boot tactic attacked that confidence directly. Once a tracker began to doubt his ability to read the signs, once he started second-guessing interpretations that had served him well for decades, his effectiveness was destroyed regardless of how sophisticated his training might be. This insight, that psychological warfare could be more effective than physical destruction, became central to Australian SAS doctrine and eventually influenced special operations thinking worldwide. But the cut-boot tactic also had darker implications that some veterans are only now beginning to discuss openly. The Australian approach to jungle warfare was effective precisely because it rejected many of the humanitarian constraints that American forces at least officially observed. The emphasis on never being detected meant that captured enemy prisoners posed an immediate operational problem. The focus on psychological warfare sometimes crossed lines that international law attempted to draw. The methods used to maintain the Ma Rung mystique were not always consistent with the Geneva Conventions. These aspects of Australian operations were never officially documented and remain controversial among veterans themselves. Some argue that extraordinary circumstances justified extraordinary measures, that the lives saved by Australian effectiveness more than balanced any ethical compromises. Others suggest that the methods they employed left psychological scars that many operators carry to this day. The cut-boot tactic sits at the less controversial end of this spectrum, a clever deception, rather than a human rights violation. But it was part of a larger system that included elements far more troubling, and understanding its role requires acknowledging the darker aspects of Australian SAS operations that official histories have consistently minimized. What cannot be disputed is the effectiveness. When Australian forces completed their withdrawal from Vietnam in 1972, they left behind a legacy that the NVA and Viet Cong remembered long after the last helicopter departed. Enemy documents captured after the fall of Saigon reveal that Australian SAS operations had achieved exactly the psychological effect their doctrine intended. References to Ma Rung appear in training materials warning new recruits about the dangers of operating in areas where Australians had been active. Tactical guidelines specifically addressed the tracking problems created by modified footwear and other deception techniques. The phantoms of the forest had become institutionalized bogeymen, their reputation outlasting their actual presence by years. Meanwhile, the lessons learned in Phuoc Tuy Province slowly worked their way through the global special operations community. British SAS, with whom the Australians maintained close relationships, incorporated elements of the Vietnam Doctrine into their own training. American Special Forces, despite official reluctance to acknowledge Australian superiority, quietly adopted techniques that had proven effective. Israeli commandos, New Zealand SAS, and other allied units studied the Australian approach and extracted principles applicable to their own operational environments. The cut-boot tactic evolved. In desert environments, operators learned to disguise their footprints as camel or livestock tracks. In urban settings, counter-tracking became counter-surveillance, with the same principles applied to electronic rather than physical signatures. The core insight, that manipulating enemy perception could be more effective than direct confrontation, proved adaptable to virtually any operational context. Today, the Australian SAS continues to be recognized as one of the premier special operations forces in the world. Their performance in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other contemporary conflicts has maintained the reputation established in Vietnam, and their training programs are sought after by allied nations looking to develop similar capabilities. Veterans of the Vietnam era watch these modern operators with a mixture of pride and concern. Pride that the traditions they established continue to produce effective warriors. Concern that the lessons learned at such cost in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy might be forgotten as new technologies and new operational environments create new challenges. The cut boot tactic itself is now a historical artifact, a reminder of a time when special operations warfare was conducted with compasses instead of GPS, with fieldcraft instead of satellite surveillance, with human intelligence instead of drone imagery. Modern operators would find it quaint, a clever trick from a simpler era of warfare. But the principle behind the tactic remains as relevant as ever. The idea that the most effective attack often targets the enemy's mind rather than his body. The understanding that uncertainty and fear can multiply combat power more effectively than additional troops or weapons. The recognition that in unconventional warfare, the side that thinks most creatively often prevails over the side with superior resources. These are the lessons that the Australian SAS taught the world in Vietnam, written in jungle mud and trackers' confusion, and the terrified whispers of enemy soldiers who learned to fear footprints that made no sense. The Ma Rung are long gone from Phuoc Tuy Province. The jungle has grown over the trails they walked, the ambush sites they prepared, the observation points where they watched and waited for days without moving. The Vietnamese who live there today remember the war as history, something that happened to their grandparents rather than to themselves. But in special operations training facilities around the world, the lessons learned by those 150 Australians continue to shape how elite warriors think about their craft. The cut boot tactic appears in counter-tracking curricula. The ambush doctrines influence engagement training. The psychological warfare principles inform information operations. And occasionally, when American Special Forces veterans gather to share war stories and professional insights, someone will mention the Australians. Will describe what it was like to work alongside men who seemed more comfortable in the jungle than in civilization. Will talk about tactics that seemed primitive until you saw them work. Will acknowledge, with the grudging respect that one professional offers another, that the Aussies had figured out something that took the Americans decades to fully appreciate. The cut boot tactic was just the beginning. But what a beginning it was. The story of those modified boots, those impossible tracks, those trackers driven to doubt their own expertise, captures something essential about the nature of unconventional warfare and the men who master it. It demonstrates that the most valuable military assets are not always the most expensive or technologically sophisticated, that creativity and adaptability can compensate for limited resources, that understanding your enemy's psychology can matter more than understanding his capabilities. The NVA never decoded the full Australian system. They learned to fear it, to avoid it, to warn their soldiers about the phantoms who left no proper trail. But they never truly understood how a handful of men from the other side of the world had learned to make the jungle itself their weapon. Perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Not the individual eliminations, impressive as the numbers were. Not the intelligence gathered, valuable as it proved. But the lasting psychological impact on an enemy who thought he owned the terrain and discovered, too late, that ownership meant nothing against men who had learned to make the very ground lie. The cut boot tactic was a message, written in modified soles and impossible tracks that said, "Your rules do not apply to us. Your expertise is worthless against us. Your confidence will destroy you." The Ma Rung wrote that message across Phuoc Tuy Province for nearly a decade, and the enemy learned to read it, even as they lost the ability to read anything else the jungle floor might tell them. In the end, that may have been the greatest tribute to Australian SAS effectiveness. Not the documented eliminations, or the intelligence reports, or the post-war analysis, but the simple fact that for years after the last Australian patrol walked out of the jungle, NVA trackers still hesitated before following footprints that didn't look quite right. The phantoms were gone, but the fear they created lived on, and somewhere in the jungles of Vietnam, the evidence of their presence still waits to be discovered. A modified boot sole, perhaps, buried in decades of leaf litter. A piece of equipment wrapped in tape that has long since rotted away. The bones of men who followed tracks that led them somewhere they never expected to go. The Ma Rung left their mark on that landscape, and on the history of special operations warfare, in ways that most people will never fully understand. But those who study the craft, who dedicate their lives to the demanding art of unconventional warfare, know the truth. The Australians changed everything. And it started with a simple, brutal question. How do you make the jungle lie? The answer, written in cut boots and impossible tracks and the terrified confusion of the best trackers in Southeast Asia, became the foundation for a new understanding of what special operations forces could achieve. Not through firepower, not through numbers, not through technological superiority, through fear, through uncertainty, through the devastating psychological impact of an enemy who could not be seen, could not be tracked, and could not be predicted. The cut boot tactic was the Australian SAS gift to the world of special operations, and the world is still learning from it today.